because I've always thought of Joy to the World as basically one of the things you sing at Christmas and one of the things you hear played in the supermarkets, don't think I'd really tuned in to the way in which actually it expresses in, I take it, a robust 18th century form. Who wrote Joy to the World? What day? Watts, yeah, so it's 18th century. I mean, there's something about those 18th century hymn writers where there is a robust sense of God's kingdom coming on earth as in heaven, and there's a transition takes place, wouldn't you know, late 18th, early 19th century, and people stop writing about that and they start writing about going off somewhere else where God is going to be king, which will be safe and away from the world. And in other words, the idea of God's kingdom coming on earth as in heaven is simply lost at that point in much of the Western tradition. I think we have to be sensitive to these things and to celebrate the things which actually get it right. And there's a lot of good stuff in the 19th century. Some of my favorite music was written in the 19th century. I mean, you know, Schubert and Brahms and people like that. But there's also within the church a great declining away from an 18th century vision. Not that they got it all right, but you hear what I say. There's something which is hugely important there. And the reason I asked for those themes to come out in this morning's music is because today we want to look at Acts really 1 to 12. We've done a bit of 1 and 2 yesterday, but I want to try and share with you something of this large sweep. I found when I was teaching in Oxford many years ago that often the students who had been to lectures by a variety of professors had gotten used to thinking of the New Testament in terms of tiny little bits. Here's these 3 or 4 verses which mean this, and this little passage which means that, and they never got the big picture. And sometimes I would come in and would do a tutorial and just do the whole of John in 1 hour. And they would say, now I get it. And something, in Myers-Briggs terms, it's biblical studies is much easier to get a PhD in biblical studies if you're an ISTJ than if you're an ENFP. Well, the P would never get the PhD anyway, because they just would never finish it. But the ST bit is how a lot of people do biblical studies. Cut it up into little bits and then just analyze the little bits and don't worry about putting them all back together. And as you gather, I'm a strong NF myself, and I just love that big picture. And when you've got the big picture, then the bits come up in 3 dimensions. And so I hope that's something of what we may conceivably experience today. And I want to begin with Peter's speech on the day of Pentecost, Acts 2:14 to 36. Acts 2:14 to 36, because this sets the tone and context for everything that is going to come. And the basic point of the speech, explaining the event that has just taken place, this extraordinary outpouring of the Spirit, the rushing mighty wind and the tongues of fire, and the people speaking so that folk think they're drunk, and so on. The explanation is that this is the fulfillment of the new covenant promises of God. Peter is quoting from the book of the prophet Joel, and these are the prophecies about what's going to happen in the last days. In other words, he is implicitly at least telling the story of the people of God as having now arrived at its new moment. This is the new day that the prophets were talking about. And already you get this sense bubbling up in the earliest days of Christianity that they know where they are in the story. We're not talking about individual isolated human beings doing some sort of a deal with God in some ahistorical framework. There is a narrative, the narrative is going forward, and this is the place it's got to, the place where now at last the Spirit gets poured out. And why has this happened? Because of Jesus. Verses 22 and following, one of the great messianic expositions in the New Testament. The exposition of Jesus as Messiah on the basis of the resurrection. This is foundational to early Christology. I said last night the resurrection means God's new world has begun and we've got a job to do. But in the middle of that, it's because Jesus really is the Messiah. He was crucified as a would-be Messiah, a messianic pretender. That was the charge at the trial. Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed? And it was the charge nailed up above his head. Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. Hugely ironic, the King of the Jews on a cross. Who ever heard of such a thing? And the resurrection says, despite appearances, that's who he really was. And all of this theology gets scrunched together into a formula which we find in the beginning of Paul's letter to the Romans. Jesus descended from the seed of David according to the flesh and designated Son of God, that's a messianic title, in power according to the Spirit of holiness by the resurrection from the dead. The resurrection demonstrates that the Davidic messianic claim of Jesus really was true all along. He didn't become Son of God at the resurrection. He was publicly designated what he was already, as we see elsewhere in Paul. That's a whole other story. So that then the long quotation you see in verses 25, 6, 7, and 8, where we're quoting from the Psalms here, that you will not abandon my soul to Hades or let your Holy One experience corruption. Interesting, when I was working on the book on resurrection, whenever was that, 2002, I guess, I realized that most of the New Testament scholars who've written about resurrection basically ignored this passage. They went for 1 Corinthians 15 and other well-known passages like that, and they went, of course, to the resurrection narratives in the Gospels. But here, just in case there was any doubt about what resurrection actually means, verse 27 and then verses 29, 30, 31, it's clear that resurrection means bodies. Resurrection means a new physicality, that Jesus' body did not corrupt. Instead, it was transformed, and now he is alive with the same body but transformed into a non-corruptible physicality, something which, again, takes imagination. By the way, you quoted that John Lennon song, Imagine There's No Heaven, and so on. There's something very ironic about that. A couple of times in my books, I have wanted to quote that song, Imagine There's No Heaven. And the publishers have said, do you know how much it'll cost you if you quote that? You know, because Yoko Ono still claims massive royalties every time anyone quotes that, which is very ironic considering the next verse of the song. Imagine no possessions. I wonder if you can. So if you want to refer to it in publications, you have to say, as we all know from one of John Lennon's famous songs, he invites us to imagine that there is no heaven. You know, then you can get away with it, but you're just not allowed to quote it. Otherwise, you pay handsomely. Isn't that weird? Anyway, how did I get into that? Oh yes, the imagination of a non-corruptible physicality. This Jesus God raised up, verse 32, and of this we are all witnesses. And that's why the Spirit is poured out, because Jesus is now the Lord of the world, and he is equipping his followers to be agents of his kingdom. Remember, it's his kingdom. We're not talking about a bullying, arrogant theocracy in which the church goes and basically forces the world to do whatever the church wants it to. We're talking about a theocracy in which it is Jesus, the one who announced the kingdom of God by going around healing and feasting and helping the weak and the meek and so on. But the result of this, verse 34, another psalm, is that we're in Psalm 110 country. And this is so important for the whole of early Christianity. Psalm 110 gets quoted again and again and again by Jesus himself, of course, in Mark 12 and so on. The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool. And the early church went on, going back to Psalm 110 to find out exactly what it meant, exactly who Jesus was. You get it in the letter to the Hebrews, expounding the very, to us, odd and remote bit about Melchizedek, not odd and remote in first century terms, of course. But the idea, therefore, of Jesus' enthronement. Jesus is raised from the dead. Therefore, he is the Messiah. He is enthroned as the one who shares the very name and throne of God. He is the Lord. He is the Kyrios. He is, dare we say, the Yahweh. And you find in various parts of the New Testament, Kyrios in the Septuagint, which carries the divine name Yahweh, being applied directly to Jesus.